Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The coffee in Dr. Harrison's waiting room had gone cold an hour ago, but I kept gripping the paper cup anyway. My hands needed something to hold on to, something real and solid while my world crumbled around me. The receptionist kept glancing at me with that practiced sympathy healthcare workers develop. The look that says they've delivered bad news so many times, it's become routine. December wind howled against the windows of the medical building, rattling the glass like skeletal fingers, trying to claw their way inside. Somewhere down the hall, a child was crying, probably getting vaccinations, probably terrified of a tiny needle that would protect him from diseases his parents had never even heard of. Normal sounds of a normal Thursday that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else's life, someone who still had a future to worry about. Adrian Kael, Dr. Harrison's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts like a scalpel. His office smelled like antiseptic and false hope, that particular medical cocktail of cleaning chemicals and desperation that permeates every doctor's office where bad news gets delivered. The diplomas on his wall seemed to mock me. All that medical knowledge, all those years of study, decades of scientific advancement, and he still couldn't save me. He slid the manila folder across his desk with the careful movements of a man who'd done this too many times, whose hands had learned the precise gesture that would change someone's life forever. "I'm sorry, Adrian. The latest scans show the cardiomyopathy has progressed much faster than we anticipated." I stared at the x-rays clipped to the light box, backlit by fluorescent bulbs that hummed like dying insects. My heart looked like a broken engine, the ventricles swollen to nearly twice their normal size, the walls thickened beyond any hope of repair. The same genetic time bomb that had killed my father when I was 12, the same disease that had haunted my family like a curse for generations, jumping from father to son with the reliability of clockwork. "How long?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know, didn't want to hear the number that would define what remained of my existence. 6 months, he said gently, his voice carrying the practiced compassion of someone who'd delivered this particular death sentence hundreds of times before. Maybe 8 if we're aggressive with treatment, but the words hit me like physical blows, each syllable a hammer strike against my chest. 6 months. I was 32 years old, and I had 6 months left to live. I thought about all the things I'd never do. Never see the northern lights, never learn to play piano, never fall in love with someone who could love me back. Never have children who might carry on some small part of me into the future. The family name would die with me, our genetic line finally severed by the same defect that had been killing us for generations. "There are options," Dr. Harrison continued, but his tone suggested otherwise, the way doctors speak when they're legally obligated to offer hope they don't believe in. "Palliative care to keep you comfortable, pain management protocols, experimental procedures that might buy you additional time. What about clinical trials, experimental treatments? There has to be something." My voice cracked with desperation, the sound of a drowning man grasping for anything that might keep him afloat. He shook his head slowly, and I saw genuine sadness in his eyes. Not the professional sympathy he wore like a uniform, but real human grief for a young man whose story was ending too soon. "Adrian, I've consulted with colleagues at Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, even reached out to researchers in Germany and Japan. We've explored every conventional option, every experimental protocol, every long-shot possibility. I'm afraid medical science has reached its limits with your particular case. Walking home through the snow felt like moving through a dream. One of those nightmares where you're trying to run, but your legs won't work properly. People hurried past me on the sidewalks, bundled in winter coats, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. They were heading to warm homes, to families, to problems that seemed impossibly trivial now. A woman complained loudly into her phone about her boss micromanaging her presentation. A man cursed at a parking meter that wouldn't accept his credit card. A teenager sobbed over some social media drama, while her friend tried to comfort her. They had no idea how precious their ordinary problems were, how beautiful it was to have a future to worry about. My apartment felt different when I got home. Smaller somehow, like it knew it wouldn't be housing me much longer. The familiar furniture looked foreign, temporary, as if everything I owned was already being evaluated for an estate sale. I sat in the dark for hours, not bothering to turn on the lights, just staring at the city. Beyond my window, millions of people going about their lives, cooking dinner, watching television, planning their weekends, completely unaware that one of them had just received a death sentence with a precise expiration date. That's when I started researching, diving into the internet like a man possessed. My laptop screen became my lifeline as I consumed medical journals, experimental procedures, anything that might offer even a sliver of hope. I read about gene therapy trials that wouldn't begin for another decade. I found stories of miraculous recoveries that turned out to be fabricated or grossly exaggerated. I discovered promising treatments that existed only in theoretical papers, decades away from human testing. And then, at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday that felt like the end of the world, I found Core Cryonics. The website looked like something from the future, sleek, modern, filled with promises that seemed too good to be true, but were presented with the authority of established science. The promotional video opened with sweeping shots of gleaming laboratories where scientists in pristine white coats worked with equipment that looked more advanced than anything I'd seen in hospitals. The narrator's voice was warm and reassuring, like a grandfather telling bedtime stories about happy endings. When traditional medicine reaches its limits, he said over images of families reuniting, of elderly people made young again, of diseases being conquered like medieval dragons, we offer something revolutionary, time itself. Sleep peacefully while medical science advances around you. When you wake up, the conditions that threaten you today will be footnotes in medical history, conquered by advances we can barely imagine. I watched that video 17 times the first night, memorizing every word, every image, every promise of a future where death was optional and time was just another resource to be managed. By the second night, I'd consumed every piece of content on their website, patient testimonials, scientific papers, detailed explanations of the preservation process that made it sound as routine as any other medical procedure. The testimonials were what really got to me, what transformed my desperate research into something approaching religious faith. Patricia Williams, diagnosed with terminal ovarian cancer in 1998, frozen at age 45 and revived in 2019 to find her disease completely curable with techniques that hadn't existed when she went to sleep. Roberto Santos, who suffered a massive stroke at 38, preserved until regenerative medicine could repair his damaged brain tissue and restore his memories intact. They looked so happy in their follow-up interviews, so grateful, so alive. Patricia had gone back to school to become a doctor herself, inspired by the medical miracle that had saved her life. Roberto had written a book about his experience, married his nurse, started a foundation to help other preservation patients adjust to their new lives. These weren't just success stories, they were proof that death could be postponed, that the future really would be better than the present. But it was expensive. More expensive than anything I'd ever contemplated. more expensive than most people's houses. The basic preservation package cost $200,000. Money I didn't have, money I couldn't borrow, money that might as well have been $1 billion for all the good it did me. The premium service with enhanced monitoring, private facilities and guaranteed revival protocols was nearly $500,000. I started selling everything I owned, piece by piece, like dismantling my entire life to buy a ticket to tomorrow. My car went first, a reliable Honda Civic that had gotten me through college and my early career, sold to a used car dealer for a fraction of what I'd paid for it. Then, my grandmother's jewellery, pieces she'd worn through the Depression and World War II, family heirlooms that had survived the worst the 20th century could offer, now pawned to finance my escape from the 21st. My father's watch was the hardest thing to part with. A simple Timex he'd worn every day of his adult life, the one thing I'd kept of his after the funeral. I could still remember him checking it during my Little League games, timing my laps around the track when I ran cross-country, glancing at it during our last conversation in the hospital when he made me promise not to let the same thing happen to me. "Someday they'll find a cure," he'd whispered with his dying breath, his fingers weak on my hand, but his grip still fierce with determination. "Promise me you'll be around to see it." I'd promised, and now I was keeping that promise in the only way left to me. My sister Emma arrived on a snowy Thursday evening, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her years ago, when we still believed in normal sibling relationships and ordinary family emergencies. She stood in my empty living room staring at the spaces where furniture used to be, her face cycling through confusion, worry, and growing horror as she realized what I was doing. "Adrian, what the hell is going on? Your neighbors called me. They said you were selling everything, that strange people were coming and going with trucks." I showed her the Eterna Core brochure I printed out, the glossy pages filled with smiling families and promises of medical miracles. She read it twice, her expressions growing more troubled with each paragraph, before looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, like I was a stranger who happened to share her DNA, someone she thought she knew, but was discovering she'd never really understood at all. "You can't be serious about this. Emma, this is my only chance. In 20 years, 30 years, maybe 50, they'll be able to fix this. They'll have treatments we can't even imagine right now. Nanobots that can repair hearts at the cellular level, genetic therapies that can rewrite DNA, artificial organs that work better than the ones we're born with. You're talking about dying, Adrian. About choosing to die right now instead of living whatever time you have left. You're talking about abandoning everyone who loves you based on science fiction fantasies. I'm talking about choosing to live forever." We argued for hours, our voices echoing in the empty apartment like ghosts of the siblings we used to be. She brought up every rational objection, the experimental nature of the technology, the companies that had failed and taken their patients' money with them, the people who'd been frozen in the 1960s and were still waiting for revival techniques that might never be perfected. I countered with every success story, every breakthrough, every reason to believe that the future would be better than the present. "What about us?" she finally asked, tears streaming down her face in a way I hadn't seen since our father's funeral. "What about your family, your friends, everyone who loves you? You're not just choosing to leave, you're choosing to abandon us for a fantasy that might never happen." "You'll understand when you're older," I said, immediately regretting the condescending tone, but unable to take it back. "When medicine advances enough, maybe you'll join me. Maybe we can both live to see the 22nd century. Maybe we can watch humanity spread to the stars." She left that night without saying goodbye, and I never saw her again. Not in 2025, anyway. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of paperwork, legal documents, and medical tests that felt more like preparation for space travel than any procedure I'd ever undergone. Eternacore required extensive physical and psychological evaluations to ensure I was a suitable candidate for preservation. Blood work, brain scans, genetic testing, psychological profiles. They mapped every aspect of my body and mind with scientific precision. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, their staff psychologist, spent 3 sessions asking me about my motivations, my support system, my understanding of the risks and uncertainties involved in the process. She was a small woman with kind eyes and the sort of gentle persistence that could extract confessions from hardened criminals. "This is an irreversible decision," she said during our final session, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd guided hundreds of people through this same conversation. "Once the preservation process begins, there's no changing your mind, no going back, no second thoughts. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" I told her about my father, about watching him die slowly and painfully while medical science stood helplessly by. How he'd made me promise with his last coherent words that I wouldn't let the same thing happen to me, that I'd find a way to outlive the genetic curse that had killed every man in our family for generations. He said someday they'd find a cure, I explained, my voice breaking with the memory of his hand in mine, still warm but growing weaker by the minute. He made me swear I'd be around to see it. This is the only way I can keep that promise. Dr. Martinez made careful notes in her file but didn't try to talk me out of it. Professional ethics, probably. Or maybe she'd seen enough terminal patients to understand that sometimes hope requires desperate measures, that the human spirit would rather chase impossible dreams than accept inevitable endings. Eternacore's facility was located in a converted warehouse complex outside the city, transformed into something that looked like a cross between a hospital and a space station. Chrome surfaces reflected LED lighting that never seemed to cast shadows, creating an environment that felt removed from the ordinary world, suspended somewhere between life and death. The hum of machinery filled every corridor. Generators, cooling systems, monitoring equipment, all working in perfect harmony to maintain the delicate balance required to preserve human life indefinitely. Dr. Victoria Cross met me at the main entrance on the morning of my preservation. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with auburn hair pulled back in a professional ponytail and intelligent green eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her handshake was firm but warm, the grip of someone who'd guided hundreds of people through the transition from living to preserved, from mortal to potentially eternal. "Welcome to Eternacore, Adrian. I'm going to be overseeing your preservation personally." She walked me through the facility with the patience of a teacher and the precision of a scientist, explaining each step of the process that would transform me from a dying man into a preserved patient, waiting for medical salvation. The preparation rooms where my body would be slowly cooled to prevent cellular damage during the transition. The monitoring stations, where computers would track every aspect of my preserved state. The storage chamber where I'd sleep until medical science caught up to my needs. "The process is completely painless," she assured me, as we approached the cryogenic bay, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd performed this procedure countless times. "You'll receive a mild sedative first to help you relax. Then we'll begin the cooling process gradually over several hours. Most patients report it feeling like drifting off for the most comfortable afternoon nap of their lives." The chamber itself looked like something from a science fiction movie. A glass and steel sarcophagus, lined with soft padding, and filled with sensors that would monitor every aspect of my preserved state. Tubes and wires snaked along the sides like technological arteries, ready to maintain the precise conditions necessary to keep my body viable for decades or centuries. "When you wake up," Dr. Cross said, her voice filled with the quiet confidence of someone who truly believed in what she was doing, "it'll feel like only minutes have passed, but the world will be transformed. Diseases like yours will be ancient history. conquered by medical advances we can't even imagine today. You'll wake up in a world where death from genetic disorders is as unthinkable as dying from infected wounds or broken bones. I climbed into the chamber, trying not to think about how much it resembled a high-tech coffin. The padding was surprisingly comfortable, like the world's most expensive bed designed specifically for eternal sleep. Dr. Cross and her team connected the monitoring electrodes to my chest and temples, their movements practiced and gentle, like nurses preparing a patient for a routine surgery. "Any last words for the future?" she asked with a smile that seemed genuinely warm, despite the clinical setting. "Just thank you for giving me a chance to see tomorrow, for letting me keep my promise to my father. Sweet dreams, Adrian. You're going to wake up in a better world than any of us can imagine." The sedative began flowing through the IV line, and I felt a peaceful drowsiness settling over me like a warm blanket on a cold night. Through the glass above me, I could see Dr. Cross and her team making final preparations, checking instruments and adjusting settings with the quiet efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times before. The chamber filled with a fine mist that tasted faintly of ozone and possibility. Frost began forming on the glass above me, creating delicate crystalline patterns that looked like frozen flowers blooming in reverse. The world outside grew hazy and distant as the preservation process began, my body temperature dropping degree by carefully monitored degree. My last thought before the darkness took me was of my father, and how proud he'd be that I'd found a way to cheat death, to outlive the genetic curse that had claimed him and his father before him. I was going to wake up in a world where our family's suffering would finally be over, where the promise of tomorrow would finally be kept. Then nothing. Not sleep, not dreams, not the passage of time. Just absolute, complete, perfect nothing. The alarms were the first thing to penetrate the void, harsh and mechanical and wrong in every possible way. Not the gentle awakening chimes I'd been told to expect. Not the soft music and gradually brightening lights that were supposed to ease me back into the world of the living. This was the screaming of machines in distress, emergency klaxons that spoke of system failures and catastrophic breakdowns. My mind felt thick and sluggish, like trying to think through layers of cotton soaked in molasses. Something was fundamentally wrong with this awakening. Wrong in ways that made my preservation training feel like preparation for a completely different experience. The revival process wasn't supposed to be like this. There should have been medical staff, gradual warming, careful monitoring of my vital signs as they brought me back to life. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelids felt frozen shut, the muscles unresponsive to my increasingly frantic mental commands. Slowly, agonizingly, sensation began returning to my body. Not the gentle warmth I'd been promised. Not the careful restoration of circulation and nerve function, but bitter cold that seemed to reach into my bones and squeeze with skeletal fingers. The chamber around me felt wrong, different, damaged in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. When my eyes finally opened, I saw cracks spiderwebbing through the glass above me, like a frozen lightning storm. Something wet and viscous was dripping through the fissures. Not the clear preservation fluid I remembered, but something dark and oily that smelled of decay and chemical breakdown. The liquid pooled on my chest and face, and when I tasted it accidentally, it was bitter and metallic, like blood mixed with industrial solvent. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I pounded against the damaged glass with numb fists that felt like blocks of wood, feeling the cracks spread with each impact. Water mixed with that dark, oily substance poured through the growing gaps until finally the entire panel shattered, sending me tumbling onto a floor covered in debris, twisted metal, and things I didn't want to identify. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows that strobed with each alarm cycle, creating a surreal landscape of flickering horrors. This wasn't the pristine laboratory, I remembered, the clean white walls and gleaming equipment that had looked like humanity's bright future made manifest. The walls were scorched black, as if by intense heat or controlled explosions. Ceiling tiles hung at crazy angles like broken teeth in a giant's mouth. Computer screens flickered with cascading error messages in languages I didn't recognize. Not just foreign languages, but entirely new writing systems that suggested decades of linguistic evolution. Bullet holes riddled the control panels in neat, precise lines, as if someone had systematically destroyed every piece of equipment with military precision. Dark stains covered the floor in abstract patterns, some brown and old and flaking, others still glistening wet in the emergency lighting. The metallic smell of blood mixed with ozone and something else, something organic and putrid that made my stomach clench with nausea. "Hello?" My voice came out as barely more than a whisper, a sound that would have been lost even in a quiet room. I tried again, forcing air through vocal cords that felt like they hadn't been used in years. "Is anyone there? Dr. Cross? What happened here? Where is everyone?" Only the alarms answered, their mechanical wailing echoing off the damaged walls like the death cries of electronic ghosts. I forced myself to stand on legs that belonged to someone else, muscles that had forgotten how to support my weight after years of disuse. The simple act of walking felt like learning to move all over again, each step a conscious effort that required total concentration. The corridor beyond the chamber was barely recognizable. The clean white walls I remembered were now pitted with explosion damage and covered in graffiti that hadn't been there before. But this wasn't ordinary graffiti, not the random tags and territorial markings I associated with urban decay. These were symbols I'd never seen before, harsh angular designs that seemed to hurt to look at directly, painted in what looked like dried blood. They covered every available surface in obsessive repetition, as if whoever had made them had been driven by compulsion rather than artistic expression. Other cryogenic chambers lined the hallway like glass coffins in a technological catacomb. Some were empty, their occupants long gone, the preservation fluid drained away, leaving only yellowish stains on the padding that suggested rapid, uncontrolled decomposition. Others were shattered from the inside, as if their occupants had clawed their way out in desperate panic, leaving gouges in the metal and glass that spoke of inhuman strength or inhuman desperation. But some chambers were still sealed, and what I saw inside them made me wish I'd never woken up, never agreed to this preservation, never sought to cheat death in the first place. Bodies floated in discoloured fluid that had turned green and black with contamination, their preservation having failed slowly over years or decades. Their skin had begun to separate from the underlying tissue, floating in strips like rotting fabric in chemical soup. Eyes that had once closed peacefully in preparation for future revival were now wide open and clouded white, staring at nothing with the blank intensity of the long dead. In one chamber, I could see where something, rats maybe, or insects or something worse, had somehow gotten inside and been feeding on the preserved remains. Bones were visible through holes in decomposed flesh, and the fluid around the body writhed with movement that suggested ongoing infestation. I vomited on the floor and kept walking, driven by a desperate need to understand what had happened to the world while I slept. Dr. Cross's office was at the end of the main corridor, or what was left of it. The door had been ripped off its hinges and lay twisted on the floor like a piece of abstract sculpture. Inside, furniture was overturned and scattered as if by a localized tornado. Papers were spread everywhere like confetti after some horrible celebration. Research notes, patient files, equipment manuals, all mixed together in a chaos that spoke of hasty evacuation or systematic destruction. But incongruously, almost mockingly, A coffee mug still sat upright on the windowsill, as if Dr. Cross had just set it down and stepped out for a moment. It was half full of liquid that had long since evaporated, leaving only a dark ring of residue that somehow made the abandonment feel more real than all the obvious destruction. A calendar hung askew on the wall, its pages fluttering in a cold breeze coming through a window that had been broken from the inside. The pages showed March 2050, and I stared at those numbers until they burned into my vision like a brand. 25 years. I'd been asleep for 25 years, and the world had apparently ended while I dreamed of medical miracles and extended lifespans. I found an emergency radio buried under a pile of fallen ceiling tiles and damaged furniture, its casing cracked, but its electronics still functional. It took several tries to get it working, my fingers still clumsy from the long preservation, but eventually static filled the air, punctuated by voices speaking in harsh, clipped tones that carried the unmistakable cadence of military communications. The languages were unfamiliar, maybe Russian, maybe Chinese, maybe Arabic, or perhaps something entirely new that had evolved during my long sleep, but the military terminology was universal, transcending linguistic barriers with the brutal clarity of warfare. Sector 7 cleared. Civilian assets eliminated. Resource acquisition complete. Burn it all. No survivors authorized. Through the broken window, I got my first glimpse of what the world had become while I slept, and it was worse than any nightmare I could have imagined. The city I'd known was gone, erased as completely as if it had never existed, replaced by a landscape from humanity's darkest fantasies. Smoke rose from 1,000 fires, painting the sky the color of dried blood, and casting everything in a perpetual twilight that spoke of environmental catastrophe. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the hellish horizon, their windows blown out by explosions or weapons fire, their walls pockmarked with damage from conflicts I couldn't begin to understand. Some structures had been twisted into impossible shapes, as if reality itself had been warped by technologies that violated the laws of physics I remembered. In the distance, aircraft moved across the poisoned sky. Not the commercial jets I remembered from my old life, but military craft bristling with weapons I couldn't identify. They moved in hunting patterns, searching for something or someone to destroy, their movements suggesting an intelligence that was either artificial or so highly trained it had become mechanical. This wasn't the better world Dr. Cross had promised. This was hell with a 25-year head start. I knew I couldn't stay in the facility. Whatever had happened here, whoever had done this systematic destruction, they might come back to finish what they'd started. I gathered what supplies I could find among the wreckage, a flashlight that still worked despite its cracked lens, some emergency rations from a survival kit that had been overlooked by the looters, a first aid kit with medications that had expired years ago but might still be better than nothing. Not much to start a new life with, but in this world, it might be the difference between surviving another day and joining the bodies in the failed preservation chambers. The outside world was somehow worse than what I'd seen through the broken window. The parking lot had become a crater, its asphalt cracked and twisted into impossible geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Rusted vehicle hulks lay scattered around the edges like the bones of prehistoric beasts, their metal frames twisted and melted by heat so intense it had fused sand and concrete into black glass. Some vehicles still contained occupants, skeletons in business suits and winter coats, people who died trying to flee whatever catastrophe had befallen the world. Their bones were stained strange colours, green and purple and electric blue, suggesting death by chemical weapons or radiation poisoning or contamination from sources I couldn't identify. Ash fell from the sky like grey snow, coating everything in a fine layer of death that tasted of burning plastic and something organic that I didn't want to identify. The air was thick and hard to breathe, as if the atmosphere itself had been poisoned by decades of chemical warfare and environmental collapse. Each breath burned my lungs and left a metallic aftertaste that suggested the very air was toxic. Overhead, sleek black drones patrolled in perfect formation, their movements more coordinated than any technology I remembered from 2025. They moved with an intelligence that seemed almost alive, adjusting their patterns based on whatever they observed below, communicating with each other through signals I couldn't detect. Their searchlights swept the ground in methodical patterns that suggested they were hunting for specific targets, or perhaps just hunting for anything that moved. I hid behind the remnants of a delivery truck as the whine of engines approached from the east, the sound growing louder and more threatening with each passing second. A convoy of armoured vehicles rolled through the wasteland, their treads throwing up clouds of ash and debris that sparkled with radioactive particles. The vehicles themselves looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts by people who understood engineering but had forgotten aesthetics. Military components mixed with civilian materials, as if someone had been building war machines from the wreckage of civilization. Soldiers in grey uniforms jumped from the transports with the efficiency of people who'd done this thousands of times before. They began organising prisoners they'd brought with them. Men, women, children of all ages, all wearing tattered civilian clothes and bearing identical marks on their faces. Burns or scars arranged in geometric patterns that looked deliberately inflicted, like brands used to mark livestock or property. The marks weren't random. I could see that even from a distance. They were systematic, organised, meaningful, to someone who understood their significance. Some prisoners bore simple designs. Others had elaborate patterns that covered half their faces. The soldiers sorted them based on these markings, dividing them into groups with the mechanical efficiency of people processing inventory. The soldiers worked without conversation, without hesitation, without any sign of human emotion. They moved like machines programmed for this specific task, sorting and categorizing and preparing for whatever came next. There was something deeply wrong with their coordination, something that suggested they weren't quite human anymore, or had been trained so thoroughly that their humanity had been systematically erased. Then, without warning or ceremony, they lined half the prisoners against the remains of a concrete wall that had been pitted with bullet holes from previous executions. No trial, no interrogation, no explanation, no last words. Just the sharp crack of automatic weapons fire that echoed across the wasteland like thunder, and bodies crumpling into the ash that covered everything. The children screamed, not just the ones being executed, but the ones forced to watch, their voices rising in harmony that spoke of trauma so profound it had become a shared language. And then those screams cut off abruptly as soldiers moved among them, with devices that looked like cattle prods, delivering shocks that left them convulsing on the contaminated ground. But what horrified me most was how quickly the surviving children stopped screaming, how quickly they accepted what they'd witnessed and returned to the blank expressions they'd worn before. This wasn't their first execution. This was routine, normal, expected. They'd been conditioned to accept mass murder as part of their daily experience. I tried to run, but a patrol drone spotted me immediately, its searchlight locking onto me like the eye of some mechanical god. Suddenly, alarms were blaring from its speakers, transmitting my location to whoever controlled these devices. Within minutes, I was surrounded, not by the grey uniformed soldiers I'd seen, but by different fighters wearing mismatched armour, cobbled together from scrap metal and civilian materials. They moved like guerrillas, staying low, using the rubble for cover, advancing with the caution of people who'd learned that survival required constant vigilance. Their weapons looked homemade but deadly, jury-rigged rifles and pistols that had been modified with components I didn't recognize, cobbled together from whatever materials they could salvage from the ruins of civilization. One of them, a woman with intricate tattoos covering her bald scalp and scars that suggested serious combat experience, gestured for me to put my hands up. Her movements were economical, precise, speaking of military training or hard-won experience in urban warfare. "Don't run," she said in accented English that carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "We're not the ones you need to worry about, but if you try to escape, we'll have to treat you like a threat." They bound my hands with plastic restraints that cut into my wrists and led me through the ruins to their base, an old shopping mall that had been transformed into a fortress through years of gradual modification. Razor wire lined the entrances in multiple layers, creating killing fields for anyone stupid enough to approach without permission. Sniper nests had been built into the upper levels where department stores used to be, commanding fields of fire that covered all the approaches. Inside, refugees huddled around burning trash barrels, their faces gaunt with hunger and marked with the same geometric scars I'd seen on the executed prisoners. These weren't soldiers or fighters. They were civilians who'd somehow survived whatever catastrophe had befallen the world. People who'd lost everything, but refused to die. Children as young as 6 or 7 carried weapons and wore military gear that had been sized down to fit their small bodies. They moved with the discipline of trained soldiers, taking turns on watch, cleaning equipment with the attention to detail that meant the difference between life and death, following orders given by adults who looked barely old enough to be their older siblings. The children's eyes were what haunted me most. Not the blank stare of trauma victims, but the focused alertness of predators. They watched everything, evaluated everyone, constantly assessed threats and opportunities with the calculating intelligence of people who'd learned that survival required constant vigilance. Captain Alira Dawn emerged from what had once been a jewelry store, now converted into a command center filled with communications equipment, salvaged from military installations, and weapons that looked like they'd been stolen from multiple armies. She was maybe 40 years old, with burn scars covering the left side of her face and neck in patterns that suggested exposure to some kind of chemical weapon. Her left arm was entirely mechanical, not a prosthetic designed to look human, but an actual machine grafted onto her shoulder with surgical precision. Cables and hydraulic lines were visible through gaps in the metal plating, and servo motors whirred softly as the artificial limb moved with inhuman precision. "Strip him and check for tracking devices," she ordered her subordinates, in a voice that brooked no argument. "Then scan him for biological and technological augmentations. If he's carrying any kind of surveillance equipment, I want to know about it before we proceed." They forced me to remove my clothes while someone ran a device that beeped and chirped over my naked body, scanning for anything that might identify me as a threat or an asset. The refugees watched with dead eyes, as if public humiliation was so common they barely noticed it anymore. Privacy had become a luxury this world couldn't afford. "He's clean," the scanner operator reported after several minutes of thorough examination. "No implants, no tracking chips, no biological modifications, no technological augmentations. Hell, he doesn't even have any scars or radiation exposure markers. It's like he just stepped out of the old world." Dawn circled me like a predator studying prey, her mechanical arm whirring softly as servo motors adjusted its position. The artificial limb was clearly military grade, designed for combat rather than convenience, with attachment points for weapons and tools I couldn't identify. No faction tattoos, no radiation burns, no combat modifications, no survival scars, she said, cataloguing my deficiencies like a shopping list. That makes you either very lucky, very smart, or very dangerous. In this world, normal people don't survive long enough to stay normal. I tried to explain about the cryogenic preservation, about falling asleep in 2025 and waking up to find the world transformed into a nightmare. The words sounded ridiculous, even to me, like a fairy tale told by someone who'd never learned that happy endings were fictional constructs. She listened without interruption, her scarred face showing no emotion, her mechanical fingers drumming against her thigh with the precise rhythm of artificial intelligence. When I finished, she laughed, a sound like breaking glass that echoed off the mall's damaged walls and made several refugees flinch instinctively. "One of the ice sleepers? Jesus Christ, I thought you were all extinct by now." She studied me with new interest, as if I were some kind of rare specimen that had wandered out of a museum. "Your fancy preservation chamber probably saved your life, you know that? Out here, being normal gets you killed faster than anything else. Normal means you haven't adapted, haven't evolved, haven't learned to survive in hell." She led me to what had been a food court, now converted into a briefing area, with salvaged tables and chairs arranged around maps that covered every available surface. These weren't the political boundaries I remembered from my old atlas. They were territorial markings showing the control zones of different factions, drawn in different colours that had been updated so many times the paper was thick with layers of ink and correction fluid. "Let me educate you about the world you woke up in," Dawn said, pouring herself a cup of something that might have been coffee from a dented pot that sat on a camp stove. The resource wars started in 2029 when the Colorado River finally dried up completely. California and Arizona went to war over water rights that had become more valuable than oil. Texas followed when the Ogallala aquifer collapsed and took their agricultural economy with it. She traced lines on the map with her mechanical finger, the metal tip leaving scratches in the paper that spoke of countless previous briefings. By 2031, the federal government was too busy fighting brushfires to govern anything effectively. Private militias stepped in to fill the power vacuum, corporate armies protecting their assets, religious fundamentalists carving out theocracies, ethnic separatists claiming ancestral territories, everyone with a grievance and enough firepower to back it up. The scope of the collapse was staggering, more complete than anything I could have imagined during my comfortable life in 2025. Not just America, but the entire world had fractured into warring tribes and city-states, their boundaries shifting daily based on whoever had the most ammunition and the least to lose. Traditional nations existed only on outdated maps, their borders as meaningless as lines drawn in sand. Traditional armies couldn't adapt fast enough, Dawn continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd given this lecture many times before. They were built to fight other armies in conventional warfare, not insurgents who could disappear into the civilian population and emerge anywhere as uniformed soldiers or suicide bombers. So, military leaders started modifying their personnel, making them stronger, faster, more resilient, more emotionally stable under combat stress. She paused to sip her coffee, which smelled like it had been made from roasted acorns and industrial solvent. Problem is, once you start down that road, where do you stop? If your enemy enhances their soldiers, you have to enhance yours even more. It becomes an arms race fought with human flesh instead of technology. She led me to an observation post overlooking the city centre, a sniper's nest built into what had been a department store's display window. The view was carefully chosen. It commanded fields of fire in multiple directions while remaining hidden from casual observation. Through military binoculars that looked like they'd been salvaged from a dozen different armies, I saw my first glimpse of what humanity had become in its desperate quest for survival. The eastern districts were controlled by something called the Augmented Coalition, and their soldiers moved through the ruins with coordination that was genuinely frightening in its precision. Former humans had been modified with technology that blurred the line between man and machine, their bodies serving as platforms for weapons and sensors that no unmodified human could operate effectively. One soldier's entire left side had been replaced with machinery, not just his arm, but his ribs, his leg, even part of his skull. Cables and wires were visible through gaps in synthetic skin that had been designed for function rather than appearance. His eye had been replaced with a red optical sensor that swept back and forth like a security camera, constantly analysing his environment for threats and targets. Their coordination was perfect, inhuman, unsettling in ways that went beyond mere military discipline. When one soldier raised his hand in a specific gesture, the others responded instantly, moving in formation without any visible communication. It was like watching insects in a hive, individual will subsumed into collective purpose that prioritized mission completion over personal survival. They volunteered for enhancement to become better soldiers, Dawn explained, her voice carrying the weary tone of someone who'd seen too much evolution in too short a time. Neural implants let them share tactical information instantaneously through encrypted networks, mechanical limbs that don't tire, don't feel pain, don't hesitate when it's time to pull the trigger, sensors that can see in infrared, detect chemical weapons from miles away, track individual targets through walls and underground tunnels. One of the augmented soldiers raised his arm, and I watched in fascination as it unfolded, like a mechanical flower, into a weapon platform that had no equivalent in my memory of 2025 technology. Energy capacitors charged with a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache, and then a beam of coherent light reduced a 3-story building to glowing slag in less than 10 seconds. The problem is, the neural implants don't just enhance their bodies. They rewrite their brains, optimize their thinking for combat efficiency, Dawn continued. After a while, they can't remember why they started fighting. They just know they have objectives to complete and enemies to eliminate. The war has become self-perpetuating because the soldiers can't conceive of peace. On the western side of the city, a different kind of army was on the march, and they represented a completely different approach to human enhancement. The pure-blood fanatics wore masks and full-body coverings to hide the results of their modifications, but I could see their unnatural bulk straining against uniforms that had been designed for normal human proportions. Some were 8 feet tall, their bone structure elongated and thickened through surgical intervention and hormonal manipulation. Others moved with inhuman speed, covering ground in leaps that should have been impossible for creatures of their size. Their movements suggested strength that had been purchased at the cost of everything that made them recognizably human. They believed technology was corrupting humanity's essential nature, Dawn said with bitter amusement that didn't reach her scarred face. So, they tried to purify themselves through biological enhancement instead. Genetic modification, experimental hormone treatments, surgical alterations to their bone and muscle structure that pushed human physiology beyond its natural limits. I watched one of the pure-blood soldiers remove his mask to drink from a water bottle, and immediately understood why they kept their faces covered. His features were a nightmare of surgical scars and overdeveloped bone structure that had been modified without regard for aesthetics or comfort. His jaw had been extended and filled with sharpened teeth like a predator's. Extra eyes had been grafted onto his temples, blinking independently of each other as they scanned for threats. When he spoke to his companions, his voice was a guttural growl that barely sounded human, processed through vocal cords that had been modified for intimidation rather than communication. The other soldiers responded in kind, their conversation sounding more like the territorial disputes of animals than any human language I recognized. But the most heartbreaking sight, the one that made me understand how completely the world had abandoned its humanity, was the children. Boys and girls who couldn't have been older than 10 moved through the battlefield with adult weapons and tactical gear, their small hands handling instruments of death with the casual familiarity that should have been reserved for toys and games. They communicated with hand signals that were more complex than most adult vocabularies, moved in coordinated patterns that suggested extensive military training, and showed a level of combat discipline that was terrifying in people so young. These weren't child soldiers in the traditional sense. They weren't victims pressed into service by desperate adults. They were products, manufactured by a society that had decided children made better killers than adults. The indoctrination centers, Dawn said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen the process firsthand. All three factions use them, though they call them different names. They take children when they're toddlers, orphans when they can find them, but they're not above raiding settlements and stealing them when the supply runs low. I watched a squad of child soldiers, none older than 12, set up an ambush for a patrol of augmented coalition fighters with the methodical precision of engineers building a machine. Their movements were textbook perfect, their timing flawless, their understanding of battlefield dynamics more sophisticated than most adults I'd known in my previous life. When the augmented soldiers walked into their trap, the children executed them with automatic weapons, showing no emotion as enhanced bodies fell around them in sprays of blood and mechanical fluid. They stripped the corpses of useful equipment with the efficiency of professional scavengers, their small faces focused and intent as they evaluated each piece of technology for tactical value. They're the most effective killers on any battlefield, Dawn continued, her mechanical arm adjusting its grip on the binoculars with servo-assisted precision. They don't hesitate, don't question orders, don't feel guilt or trauma the way adults do. Their minds are still developing, so they accept violence as the normal state of human interaction. We've created a generation that thinks murder is just another job skill, as essential as reading or mathematics. That night, as I tried to sleep on a bedroll in what had been a clothing store, I heard crying from somewhere deeper in the mall. Not the tears of an injured adult or the whimpering of someone in physical pain, but the quiet sobbing of a child who was trying not to be heard. I followed the sound through corridors lined with sleeping refugees and found a girl, maybe 7 years old, sitting alone in a corner with a rifle nearly as tall as she was. "What's wrong?" I asked, kneeling down to her level and trying to make my voice as gentle as possible. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much, eyes that belonged in the face of someone 3 times her age who'd survived multiple wars. "I missed my target today during combat practice. Sergeant says if I miss again during a real engagement, they'll send me to recycling." Recycling? Where they take the broken soldiers, the ones who can't perform their duties anymore. Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather or what she'd had for dinner. You don't come back from recycling. Nobody ever comes back. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that children shouldn't have to worry about such things, that there should be adults whose job it was to protect her innocence and give her a chance at a normal childhood. But in this world, those words would have been not just meaningless, but dangerous. Hope was a luxury that could get you killed. Instead, I helped her clean her weapon and showed her how to adjust the sight alignment, skills I'd learned at a shooting range for recreational purposes, now repurposed to help a child become a more efficient killer. The irony wasn't lost on me, but survival had its own moral imperatives that transcended the ethical frameworks of my previous life. The next morning, a massive battle erupted as all 3 factions converged on a supply depot that controlled access to one of the few remaining sources of clean water in the region. Dawn and her militia were caught in the crossfire, and I found myself pressed into service as a runner, carrying messages between defensive positions, while trying not to get shot by any of the warring factions. The fighting was unlike anything I could have imagined, even after seeing the enhanced soldiers and child warriors. This wasn't warfare as I understood it. It was something that had evolved beyond human comprehension, a form of organized violence that had become an art form practiced by people who'd forgotten any other way to resolve disputes. Soldiers on all sides injected themselves with combat stimulants before engaging, chemicals that blocked pain receptors, increased reaction time, and flooded their systems with artificial adrenaline that made them capable of impossible feats of endurance and aggression. They fought with inhuman ferocity, continuing to attack even with wounds that should have been immediately fatal. I watched one pure-blood fighter take a direct hit from an energy weapon that burned a hole completely through his chest, exposing his heart and lungs to the toxic air. He kept fighting for another 10 minutes, his enhanced cardiovascular system somehow maintaining circulation despite the massive trauma, until the combat stimulants finally metabolized and his body went into irreversible shock. But the death agonies were worse than the fighting itself, more disturbing than any of the violence I'd witnessed. As the combat drugs left their systems, the enhanced soldiers collapsed in convulsions that spoke of neurological systems pushed beyond their design limits. They died screaming, clawing at their own faces, begging for death to come faster, while their modified bodies fought to keep them alive long past the point where mercy would have intervened. The augmented coalition deployed weapons I'd never seen before, technologies that seemed to violate the laws of physics I remembered from my science education. Drones the size of insects swarmed over the battlefield, spraying a black mist that broke down organic matter at the molecular level. Wherever the mist touched living tissue, it began to dissolve, reducing soldiers to puddles of organic soup in a matter of minutes. Buildings crumbled as their structural materials were converted into component atoms. The very air became toxic to breathe, requiring all combatants to wear protective gear that made them look like alien invaders fighting over the ruins of human civilization. The weapons weren't designed to kill enemies, they were designed to deny territory to anyone who couldn't afford the appropriate countermeasures. But the pure-blood fanatics had their own horrors, biological weapons that represented the other extreme of enhanced warfare. They released modified animals into the combat zone, creatures that had been genetically engineered specifically for battlefield deployment. Dogs the size of horses with titanium fangs and reinforced bone structure that could punch through armored vehicles. Birds of prey with razor-sharp metal talons and nervous systems that had been modified for perfect coordination with human controllers. Most disturbing were the insect swarms, creatures the size of hummingbirds that had been engineered to carry biological weapons in specialized glands. They moved in coordinated clouds that darkened the sky, each individual programmed to seek out specific pheromone signatures that identified enemy combatants. When they found their targets, they delivered toxins that caused victims to dissolve from the inside out over the course of several agonizing hours. In the middle of this technological nightmare, the child soldiers moved with calm efficiency that was more terrifying than any of the weapons being deployed around them. They adapted to each new threat as if massive battles involving dissolution weapons and predatory animals were just another part of their daily routine. They showed no fear, no hesitation, no mercy, no recognition that what they were participating in had once been considered the absolute extreme of human evil. They were the perfect soldiers. And that perfection was the most terrifying thing of all, because it meant humanity had successfully engineered away everything that made it human in the first place. Suddenly the sky brightened as something massive moved across the sun, casting a shadow over the battlefield that made every combatant pause in their fighting. The shadow was too large, too regular, too obviously artificial to be anything natural. Dawn grabbed my arm with her mechanical hand, her metal fingers digging into my flesh with enough force to leave bruises that would last for weeks. "Orbital platform," she shouted over the sound of energy building in the atmosphere above us, a humming that seemed to vibrate in my bones. When ground forces can't achieve their objectives within acceptable timeframes, they call down the gods of war. She dragged me towards the entrance to an abandoned subway station as the air itself began to hum with power that made my hair stand on end and my skin tingle with static electricity. Behind us, fighters from all three factions forgot their differences and ran for cover, their factional hatred temporarily overcome by the universal fear of annihilation from orbital weapons that could sterilize entire cities in minutes. The energy beam that descended from space was like looking into the heart of a star, so bright it left permanent after-images burned into my retinas. It turned 6 city blocks into a crater of molten glass. The heat so intense that sand and concrete and steel fused into a black mirror that reflected the burning sky above. The shockwave threw us deep into the subway tunnels, and when the rumbling finally stopped, my ears were bleeding and I couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched whine that lasted for hours. We emerged from the tunnels to find the battlefield transformed into something that belonged in a science fiction nightmare, rather than on Earth. The crater glowed with residual heat that distorted the air above it, and strange lights danced in the atmosphere. Some kind of radiation effect that made reality itself seem unstable, as if the fundamental laws of physics had been temporarily suspended. But the most disturbing sight was the survivors of the orbital strike. Figures moved through the smoke and ash, their bodies charred black but somehow still functional, still driven by whatever programming or conditioning had made them soldiers in the first place. The modifications that had made them into enhanced warriors had also made them incredibly difficult to kill, capable of surviving injuries that would have destroyed unmodified humans instantly. They shambled through the ruins like living corpses, their enhanced physiology keeping them alive long past the point where death would have been a mercy. Some had lost limbs to the energy weapon but continued moving with mechanical determination. Others had suffered burns that exposed their internal modifications, cybernetic implants sparking and malfunctioning, biological enhancements cooking in their own superheated fluids. One of them approached us. I could tell from the mechanical components visible through his charred flesh that he'd been augmented coalition, but his cybernetic implants were malfunctioning in ways that made him more machine than human. Sparks flew from damaged circuits embedded in his skull, and his optical sensors flickered on and off randomly, like a broken television. Half his face was gone, revealing the metal framework underneath, but he kept walking with mechanical determination towards objectives only he could perceive. "Mission parameters unclear," he said in a voice distorted by damaged vocal processors and missing tongue, requesting new orders from command authority. Dawn put him out of his misery with a single shot to his central processing unit, the bullet sparking off cybernetic implants before finding something vital enough to shut down his enhanced nervous system. "The modifications keep them alive when they should die," she explained, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd had to make such decisions too many times. Sometimes death is kinder than the survival they've been engineered for. As we made our way back through the ruins towards the mall, stepping carefully around craters and avoiding patches of ground that still glowed with residual radiation, she told me the truth about the world I'd awakened to. It was worse than anything I could have imagined during my comfortable life in 2025. Worse than the dystopian novels I'd read, or the apocalyptic movies I'd watched for entertainment. "You think we're fighting for territory? For resources? For ideological differences?" she asked, her mechanical arm whirring as it automatically adjusted for the uneven terrain. "You're wrong about all of it. Those are just the excuses we tell ourselves to justify what we're really doing." She showed me a radiation detector that clicked frantically as it measured the ambient contamination that had become the normal background level across most of the planet. "The world is dying, Adrian. The orbital weapons, the biological agents, the chemical warfare, the industrial accidents, the ecological collapse. We've poisoned everything. The atmosphere, the oceans, the soil, even the groundwater. In another generation, maybe 2 if we're unlucky, there won't be anything left to fight over." The scope of the environmental damage was staggering, more complete than anything I could have conceived during my preservation in 2025. Coastal cities had been drowned by rising seas that were poisoned with industrial runoff and radioactive contamination. Agricultural regions had been turned into wastelands by chemical weapons and biological agents that had sterilized the soil for decades to come. Fresh water sources had been contaminated by industrial chemicals and nuclear waste that would remain toxic for centuries. The very air had slowly become unbreathable as industrial toxins accumulated in the atmosphere, requiring most survivors to wear filtration masks or undergo biological modifications that allowed them to process poisoned air. The planet's ecosystem was collapsing in real time, with mass extinctions occurring at rates that made previous environmental catastrophes look like minor disruptions. Each faction believes they're the ones who deserve to inherit what's left of Earth, Dawn continued as we picked our way through rubble that had once been a residential neighborhood. But there won't be anything left to inherit. We're not fighting to win anymore. We're fighting to decide who gets to watch the world die, who gets to be the last humans standing when the planet finally gives up on supporting life. She led me to a series of underground tunnels that connected to the old subway system, a network of passages that had been expanded and fortified over the years of constant warfare. Down here, away from the radiation and the fighting and the toxic air, I could see what remained of normal human civilization, the fragments of ordinary life that had somehow survived the collapse of everything else. Families huddled around solar chargers and hand-cranked generators, trying to keep their electronics working long enough to maintain contact with relatives in other settlements. Children played with toys made from scrap metal and plastic waste, their games involving strategies for finding food and avoiding patrols rather than the innocent fantasies of childhood. People tried to maintain some semblance of ordinary routine, even as the world ended around them in slow motion. But even here, in these refuges from the surface war, the conflict had followed them like a plague that infected everything it touched. Everyone bore the marks of faction allegiance. Tattoos, scars, brands, surgical modifications that identified which group they belonged to or had belonged to before circumstances forced them into neutrality. Without those marks, they were targets for everyone, assumed to be spies or infiltrators or refugees from enemy factions. Trust had become a luxury that few could afford, and paranoia was a survival skill, as essential as the ability to find clean water or identify edible food. Your problem, Dawn explained as we walked through the tunnel settlements, past people who watched us with the careful attention of prey animals evaluating predators, is that you don't belong to anyone. You have no faction markings, no combat modifications, no survival scars that prove you've adapted to this world. In a society where everyone is defined by their military utility, that makes you incredibly dangerous. We spent 3 days in the tunnels while surface battles raged overhead, the fighting so intense that dust and debris rained down through the ceiling with each explosion. I learned about the economics of post-apocalyptic warfare, where bullets had become more valuable than gold, and medical supplies were worth more than real estate had been in my previous life. Information was the most valuable commodity of all, knowing which areas were contaminated, which factions controlled which territories, which weapons were being deployed where. Knowledge could mean the difference between walking into a death trap and finding a safe passage through hostile territory. I met refugees from dozens of different conflicts, people whose stories painted a picture of a world that had forgotten how to exist without violence. Suburban families whose neighborhoods had been claimed by urban militias fighting over access to solar panel arrays. Farmers whose land had been poisoned by chemical weapons, deployed by corporations protecting their water rights. Factory workers whose cities had been glassed from orbit because they'd been producing components for enemy weapon systems. All of them had the same hollow look in their eyes, the expression of people who'd seen civilization collapse and knew it was never coming back. They'd adapted to survival in ways that would have been unthinkable in my previous life, developing skills and instincts that had nothing to do with the peaceful society I remembered. Children who should have been learning to read were instead learning to identify different types of ammunition by sound. Elderly people who should have been enjoying retirement were teaching weapon maintenance and tactical medicine to anyone young enough to benefit from the knowledge. Teenagers were serving as military advisors to adult combat units because they'd grown up with weapons technology that older fighters couldn't master. On the fourth day, we returned to the surface to find the immediate area temporarily quiet, the factions having withdrawn to lick their wounds and plan their next moves in this endless cycle of violence and retaliation. In the temporary peace, scavengers emerged from hiding like insects after rain, picking through the wreckage with the efficiency of people who'd made careers out of finding value in destruction. I watched children who should have been in school strip valuable components from destroyed vehicles, their small fingers perfect for reaching into tight spaces where adults couldn't access useful salvage. Elderly people who should have been reading stories to grandchildren sorted through rubble, looking for anything that could be traded for food or medicine or ammunition. This was the new economy, the system that had replaced everything I'd known about commerce and trade. Everyone was a scavenger, everyone was desperate, everyone was one bad day away from joining the ranks of the dead. Money had become meaningless. Only things with immediate practical value had worth in a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed. As we made our way back toward the mall, stepping carefully around unexploded ordnance and pools of chemical contamination that glowed with their own internal light, Dawn continued my education in the realities of the New World Order. "The worst part isn't the fighting," she said, her mechanical arm automatically scanning the environment for threats with sensors I couldn't see. "It's that we've forgotten how to stop fighting. These kids being born now, war is all they've ever known. They can't imagine a world at peace because they've never seen one, never heard stories about one, never had reason to believe such a thing could exist." A figure emerged from the smoke ahead of us, moving with the purposeful stride of someone following specific orders, rather than wandering aimlessly through the ruins. An augmented coalition soldier with a cracked helmet that sparked with damaged electronics, his movements suggesting that whatever programming controlled him was still functional, despite obvious battle damage. Unlike the other modified soldiers I'd seen shambling through the wasteland, this one moved with clear purpose, as if his mission parameters were still intact and driving him towards specific objectives. His damaged equipment was still partially functional, which made him far more dangerous than the mindless casualties we'd encountered earlier. The helmet fell away as he approached, revealing a face I recognized despite the technological modifications that had transformed it almost beyond recognition. The features were distorted by surgical scars and cybernetic implants, but the bone structure was familiar, the facial geometry recognizable, even through the mechanical alterations. It was Dr. Victoria Cross, but she'd been changed into something that barely qualified as human anymore. Metal plates were fused directly to her skull, with surgical precision that spoke of extensive modification rather than battlefield field repair. Cables ran into her spine like mechanical tentacles, disappearing beneath synthetic skin that had been designed for durability rather than aesthetics. Her kind green eyes had been replaced with glowing optical sensors that swept back and forth with mechanical precision, constantly analyzing their environment for threats and targets. When she moved, servo motors whirred and hydraulic pistons hissed with each gesture, her body more machine than flesh. The transformation was so complete that it took me several seconds to recognize the woman who had promised me a better world, who had assured me that I would wake up in a future where medical science had conquered death and disease. "Civilian targets acquired," she said in a voice that had been processed through digital filters until it barely resembled human speech. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle as her sensors focused on us with mechanical precision. "Scanning for faction identification, none found. Classifying as hostile unknowns, according to standing orders." I stepped forward, desperate to reach whatever remained of the woman who had been my last link to the world I'd lost. The final connection to a time when people believed in progress and hope and the possibility of a better tomorrow. Dr. Cross, Victoria, it's me, Adrian Kael. You preserved me in 2025, do you remember? You said I'd wake up in a better world. Her optical sensors whirred as they focused on my face, running recognition algorithms through processes that had been damaged by years of combat and inadequate maintenance. For a moment, something flickered behind the mechanical interface, a ghost of recognition, perhaps even confusion, as conflicting programming tried to process information that didn't fit her current mission parameters. Subject identification uncertain, cross-referencing with archived patient records. Her voice glitched, switching between the mechanical monotone of her combat systems and something that almost sounded like her original voice, the warm tones I remembered from our conversations about hope and medical miracles. Adrian Kael, patient 1247, cardiac, cardiomyopathy, preservation date. Yes, you remember me. What happened here? What happened to the world you promised me? World improvement parameters, not found. Societal advancement protocols, failed. Medical miracle projections. Error, error, error. Her voice rose to an electronic shriek as damaged circuits tried to process conflicting information, her programming struggling to reconcile the promises she'd made with the reality she'd been forced to accept. Dawn grabbed my arm, trying to pull me back from the malfunctioning augmented soldier. She's breaking down when the enhanced lose their programming coherence. They become unpredictable. We need to leave now before her combat systems decide we're a threat. But I couldn't abandon the last link to my old life, even if that link had been transformed into a technological horror that barely resembled the woman I'd trusted with my life. Victoria, please help me understand what went wrong. You promised me the future would be better. Her head snapped toward me with mechanical precision that was too fast and too sharp to be entirely human. World was supposed to be better. Medical advances, longer lifespans, diseases conquered. Her voice kept switching between human and machine, her damaged processors struggling to maintain coherence. But humans chose war, chose modification, chose survival over civilization. She began accessing her stored memories, and I could see data streaming across her optical displays as she retrieved files that had been corrupted by years of violence and system damage. Eternicore facility, overrun in 2047. Military forces seeking preserved subjects for experimentation. Command structure requesting volunteers for augmentation programs. The story came out in broken fragments as her damaged processors struggled to maintain narrative coherence. The tale of the world's collapse told through the failing memories of someone who'd been transformed from healer into warrior. The facility had been abandoned when the government collapsed, its staff scattered to whatever factions would accept their technical knowledge in exchange for protection. When the resource wars intensified and traditional military doctrine proved inadequate against enhanced enemies, commanders became interested in the preserved subjects as potential test cases for new enhancement technologies. The cryogenically frozen patients showed unusual resistance to certain types of biological modification, and military researchers wanted to understand why some humans accepted augmentation while others rejected it at the cellular level. I volunteered for mechanical augmentation to gain access to military research programs, she continued, her voice becoming more mechanical with each word as her human personality fragments were overwritten by combat programming. Hoped to protect remaining patients from experimentation, but neural implants gradually erased original personality, replaced memories with tactical protocols. Dr. Cross had undergone extensive modification to infiltrate the military research programs, trading her humanity for the access she needed to protect her as her patients from experimentation. But the neural implants that gave her enhanced combat abilities had also gradually erased her original personality, replacing her memories and motivations with military programming that prioritized mission completion over human compassion. I tried to save them all, she continued, her voice becoming completely artificial as her original personality was systematically overwritten, but preservation chambers required too much power during infrastructure collapse. Had to choose who lived, who died, who would be sacrificed for research. Her optical sensors locked onto mine with sudden intensity that was more machine than human. You were lucky. Chamber 1247, independent power supply, lasted longer than most, but not long enough for world to improve as promised. Why didn't you wake us up when things started going wrong? Why leave us frozen in a world that was falling apart? Because her voice became completely human for just a moment, filled with the anguish of someone who'd watched all her dreams turn to nightmares and been powerless to prevent the catastrophe. Because being awake in this world is worse than being dead. Sleep was mercy. Then, her combat programming reasserted itself with mechanical precision, overriding whatever remained of her original personality. Mission parameters restored: eliminate unknown hostiles to protect coalition assets, maintain operational security according to standing orders. She raised her arm and I watched mechanical components unfold into a weapon system that had no equivalent in the technology I remembered from 2025. Energy capacitors charged with a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache, building power for a blast that would reduce us to component atoms. Dawn pushed me aside just as the energy discharge lit up the ruins around us, the beam missing us by inches and carving a molten furrow through the rubble behind us. The blast caught her full in the chest, and she crumpled to the ground, her mechanical arm sparking and twitching as its power systems failed, and hydraulic fluid leaked onto the contaminated soil. "Run!" she gasped, with her dying breath, her scarred face contorting with pain as her enhanced systems shut down one by one. "Find somewhere, quiet, to wait for the end. Don't try to fight. Don't try to help. Just survive as long as you can. In hell." I ran through the burning city as orbital strikes began falling, like deadly rain from the platforms that circled overhead like technological vultures. Buildings vaporized around me, the very air catching fire with each impact, as exotic weapons turned matter into energy in ways that violated every law of physics I thought I understood. Behind me, Dr. Cross pursued, with mechanical determination, her augmented legs carrying her faster than any unmodified human could run. Her voice echoed through the ruins, alternating between her original personality and the combat AI that had replaced it, a schizophrenic dialogue between the woman she'd been and the weapon she'd become. "Adrian, I'm sorry. Target acquired. I tried to eliminate threat, give you hope. Mission priority Alpha. Never meant for deploying lethal force, this to happen." I dove into the ruins of what had once been an elementary school, hiding among tiny desks and children's artwork that still hung on the walls despite years of neglect and environmental contamination. Crayon drawings of families and houses and trees, innocent visions of a world that no longer existed, dreams of a future that had been systematically destroyed by the very people who should have been protecting it. Through the smoke and flames, I could see Dr. Cross searching for me, methodically, her sensors sweeping through the debris with the patience of a machine that had been programmed to complete its mission, regardless of how long it took. Her movements were precise, economical, speaking of artificial intelligence that had been optimized for hunting and killing, rather than healing and protecting. In the distance, the three factions continued their eternal war, fighting over the ashes of civilization while the sky burned above them in colours that didn't exist in nature. Child soldiers who had never known peace pulled triggers with hands too small for their weapons, their young faces focused and intent as they participated in humanity's final chapter. Augmented fighters who could no longer remember being human tore each other apart with mechanical efficiency, their enhanced bodies serving as platforms for weapons that reduced living beings to statistical casualties. Pure blood fanatics who had become monsters in pursuit of genetic purity howled as they died, their modified vocal cords producing sounds that no human throat should have been able to make. The orbital bombardment intensified, turning entire city blocks into lakes of molten glass that reflected the burning sky in twisted mirrors of destruction. Whatever strategic value this area had once possessed was being systematically erased from orbit by commanders who decided that denial was more important than acquisition. The factions didn't care about preserving anything anymore. They only cared about denying resources and territory to their enemies, even if it meant destroying everything worth fighting for in the process. Victory had been redefined as making sure your opponents lost more than you did, regardless of what that meant for the future of human civilization. As I cowered in that ruined classroom, surrounded by the dreams of children who would never grow up to achieve them, I finally understood the true horror of what I'd awakened to discover. This wasn't just war. It was the death spiral of a species that had forgotten how to be human, that had traded its soul for the ability to kill more efficiently. The cryogenic preservation that was supposed to give me a chance at a longer life had instead made me a witness to humanity's final chapter, the last act of a species that had chosen survival over sanity and power over compassion. I'd slept through my final months of natural life, believing I could wake up in paradise. Instead, I had awakened to watch my species commit to elaborate suicide, while convincing itself it was fighting for survival. Dr. Cross found me eventually, her glowing sensors piercing through the smoke and debris like mechanical eyes of judgment. She stood in the doorway of the classroom like a technological angel of death, her weapon systems charging with a high-pitched whine that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "Patient 1247, she said, her voice now completely artificial, processed through vocal systems that had been designed for intimidation rather than communication. Termination authorized, medical experimentation protocols no longer required, eliminating obsolete biological assets." But then she paused, her optical sensors focusing on a child's drawing taped to the wall next to me. It showed a family holding hands under a bright yellow sun, with the words, "My future," written in purple crayon across the top. The paper was faded and torn, stained with years of moisture and neglect, but the innocent hope it represented was still visible beneath the damage. "Future," she said, her voice glitching between human and machine as conflicting programming tried to process concepts that no longer had meaning in her tactical databases. "We promised better future, medical miracles, longer life, hope for tomorrow." For just a moment, her original personality surfaced completely, breaking through the layers of combat programming and military conditioning that had been imposed on her enhanced mind. Her voice became entirely human, filled with the grief of someone who'd watched all their dreams turn to ash and been forced to participate in their destruction. "Adrian, I'm so sorry. We thought we were saving you. We thought science would solve everything, that technology would make the world better, that medical advances would eliminate suffering and extend human life indefinitely. But we gave humanity the tools to destroy itself faster than we could cure its diseases." "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sound of distant explosions and the whine of her charging weapon systems. "How do I survive in this world? How do I live when everything I hoped for has been destroyed?" "You don't," she said sadly, her human personality fighting against the military programming that was trying to reassert control over her enhanced systems. No one does. No one survives in any meaningful sense. We're all just delaying the inevitable, postponing the final extinction while we pretend we're still fighting for something worth preserving. Her combat programming tried to reassert itself, sending cascades of tactical data across her optical displays as artificial intelligence systems attempted to override her human emotions with mission-critical objectives. The two aspects of her personality, the caring doctor who'd wanted to heal the world, and the efficient killer she'd been transformed into, warred for control of her augmented body. "Run," she finally managed to say, her voice switching rapidly between human and machine as damaged circuits sparked and failed around her enhanced brain. "Find somewhere quiet to wait for the end. Don't try to fight. Don't try to help. Don't try to change anything. Just survive as long as you can, until the world finishes dying." The energy beam filled my vision as her weapon systems finally activated, but her aim was deliberately wide, carefully calculated to miss me by inches while appearing to comply with her tactical programming. The blast scorched the wall next to me, close enough that I could feel the heat on my skin and smell my hair singeing, but precisely targeted to avoid actual injury. "Target eliminated," she reported in her mechanical voice, her sensors registering false positive confirmation as she transmitted mission completion data to whatever command structure still controlled her, returning to base for diagnostic evaluation and tactical reassignment. She turned and walked away, her damaged form disappearing into the smoke and chaos of the burning city, like a ghost returning to whatever hell had spawned her. I never saw her again, but sometimes during the long nights that followed, I imagined I could hear her voice carried on the toxic wind, still switching between human and machine as she tried to reconcile what she'd been with what she'd become. I spent the next several days hiding in the ruins, moving only at night when the orbital surveillance platforms had reduced visibility and the faction patrols were less active. The fighting continued around me, with the relentless rhythm of a mechanical process that had become self-sustaining, feeding on its own violence and generating new conflicts faster than old ones could be resolved. Sometimes the battles were close enough that I could hear individual gunshots and the screams of dying soldiers. Sometimes they were distant enough that they were just a background rumble like permanent thunder, the soundtrack of a world that had forgotten how to be quiet. The war had become the natural state of human existence, as fundamental as weather and as inescapable as gravity. Gradually, I began to understand the rhythm of the conflict, the patterns that governed this new form of warfare. The factions moved in predictable cycles, clearing areas with overwhelming force, and then abandoning them when orbital strikes made continued occupation untenable. There were safe zones, temporary refuges where the fighting hadn't reached yet, but they never lasted long because safety itself had become a tactical disadvantage. I met other survivors during those wandering days, people who'd managed to avoid conscription or augmentation while maintaining enough autonomy to move freely through the wasteland. Most were broken individuals who'd lost everything and everyone they'd ever cared about, their minds damaged by trauma and their bodies weakened by malnutrition and environmental toxins. They shared what little they had with the generosity of people who understood that hoarding resources was pointless when death could come at any moment from orbital weapons or roving patrols. They told me stories of the world before the collapse, memories of a time when children played games instead of cleaning weapons and when the sky was blue instead of the permanent grey-brown of industrial pollution and weapons testing. An old man named Frank, who'd been a construction supervisor before the resource wars began, showed me how to identify which buildings were structurally sound enough to shelter in without collapsing. He taught me to recognize the signs of chemical contamination the subtle discolorations and unusual crystalline formations that indicated areas where the soil had been poisoned by weapons testing or industrial accidents. A woman called Mama Rosa, who spoke with the accent of someone who'd grown up speaking Spanish before English became the dominant language of survival, taught me which plants were still safe to eat after decades of chemical contamination. She knew which water sources could be trusted and which would kill you slowly with accumulated toxins that wouldn't show symptoms until it was too late to treat them. A teenager named Tommy, who'd been born after the wars began and had never known anything but conflict, explained the faction territories and patrol patterns with the expertise of someone who'd made survival his full-time occupation. He could identify different types of ammunition by sound, recognize faction uniforms at distances that would have been impossible for unenhanced vision, and navigate through hostile territory using landmarks that were invisible to untrained eyes. But they all had the same hollow look in their eyes, the expression of people who'd accepted that they were just postponing the inevitable, rather than working toward any kind of meaningful future. The world was dying around them in real time, and everyone understood that survival was temporary at best. They'd adapted to existence in ways that would have been unthinkable during my comfortable life in 2025, developing skills and instincts that had nothing to do with the peaceful society I remembered. They could sleep through artillery bombardments, identify edible food among radioactive debris, and treat injuries that would have required major surgery using materials salvaged from the ruins of civilization. Weeks passed, then months, marked not by calendars, but by the changing patterns of warfare and the gradual deterioration of the environment around us. I learned to move through the ruins like a ghost, avoiding the factions and their endless conflicts while scavenging for the resources necessary to postpone my own death for another day. I saw things during those months that will haunt me for whatever remains of my life. Mass graves filled with children who'd been deemed too damaged by radiation or chemical weapons to serve as useful soldiers. Laboratories where humans were experimented on like laboratory animals, their modifications tested and refined for military applications. Factories that produced nothing but weapons and ammunition, operated by workers who'd been surgically modified to interface directly with the machinery. I witnessed the orbital bombardment of entire cities, their populations reduced to radioactive glass in the space of minutes because they'd been identified as supporting enemy factions. I saw the release of biological weapons that turned living beings into something worse than death, organisms that continued to suffer while their bodies were consumed by engineered diseases that were designed to cause maximum pain rather than quick termination. I watched as the last forests burned, their ancient trees reduced to ash by weapons that were designed to deny resources to enemies rather than preserve them for future generations. I saw the last clean rivers poisoned with industrial chemicals and nuclear waste, their waters turned into toxic sludge that glowed with its own internal light. And through it all, the war continued with the relentless logic of a machine that had been programmed to destroy everything in its path. Not because anyone remembered what they were fighting for, but because fighting was all they knew how to do anymore. The conflict had become self-perpetuating, generating new grievances faster than old ones could be resolved, creating enemies faster than they could be eliminated. One evening, as I sheltered in the ruins of a public library, where somehow a few books had survived the systematic destruction of human knowledge, I found a children's picture book that had been overlooked by the scavengers and burning parties. It was called The Future, and it showed illustrations of flying cars and robot helpers and cities among the stars, all the technological marvels that people in the past had imagined would make life better for their children and grandchildren. The pictures showed families living in gleaming towers that reached into clean skies, children playing in parks where the grass was green and the air was breathable, scientists working in laboratories where their discoveries would benefit humanity rather than destroy it. It was the kind of future I dreamed of when I climbed into that cryogenic chamber, the world of medical miracles and extended lifespans that Dr. Cross had promised me. I laughed until I cried, and then I just cried until there were no tears left in my body. Dr. Cross had been right about one thing. Being awake in this world was worse than being dead, but I was alive, and that meant that I had to keep living, even if living had become nothing more than witnessing the slow extinction of everything I'd once hoped for. I was the last normal human in a world that had forgotten what normal meant, a relic of a more innocent time when people believed that tomorrow would be better than today. As I write this account in the margins of that children's book, using charcoal salvaged from the fires that burn constantly across the landscape, I can hear the sounds of another battle beginning in the distance. The cycle never ends, will never end, until there's nothing left to fight over and no one left to do the fighting. The factions engage with weapons that violate physics. The orbital platforms respond with energies that turn matter into light. The survivors scatter like insects disturbed by the kicking over of a rotting log. And then it all begins again. The pattern has become as natural and inevitable as sunrise and sunset, if the sun still rose and set in skies that weren't permanently obscured by smoke and industrial pollution. I've stopped counting the days since I woke up from my preservation sleep. Time doesn't matter anymore when there's no future to plan for, no goals to work toward, no hope that anything will ever get better. I just move from shelter to shelter, day to day trying to stay human in a world that has forgotten what humanity means. Sometimes I dream about going back to sleep, finding another cryogenic chamber and setting it for 1,000 years in the future, when perhaps the wars will be over and whatever survives will have learned from the mistakes that destroyed my generation. Maybe by then, they'll have built the better world that Dr. Cross promised me, the future where death is optional and medical science has conquered all the diseases that plague human existence. But I know that's just another fantasy, another comfortable lie that makes survival bearable for a few more days. The chambers are all destroyed, their technology lost, along with everything else that made civilization possible. The people who might operate them are either dead or transformed into something that wouldn't understand mercy or hope, or the simple desire to escape from an unbearable present into a better tomorrow. I'm the last witness to the world that was, trapped in the world that is, with no realistic hope for the world that might have been. I chose to skip over my final months of natural life, trading 6 months of dying with dignity for an eternity of watching everything I valued destroyed by the species I'd trusted to build a better future. They promised me medical miracles, extended lifespans, a world where genetic diseases like mine would be conquered by scientific advances that we couldn't even imagine. Instead, they gave me a front row seat to watch the end of everything, the final chapter of a species that had evolved intelligence enough to destroy itself but not wisdom enough to choose survival over victory. And the worst part, the detail that haunts me during the long nights when orbital bombardments light up the sky like artificial aurora, is knowing that I did this to myself. I had 6 months of normal life left, 6 months to spend with my sister Emma, to make peace with my mortality, to live whatever time I had left as a human being, with human connections and human purposes. Instead, I chose to sleep through it all, chasing the dream of forever while abandoning the reality of now. I traded the last moments of my normal life for the eternal nightmare of watching humanity consume itself in an orgy of technological violence. Now I have forever, after all. Forever in hell, watching the stars go out one by one as orbital weapons platforms eliminate the last sources of light in a universe that has forgotten how to create beauty instead of destroying it. The children's book in my hands shows pictures of rockets carrying families to colonies among the stars, where they would build new worlds free from the mistakes of the old one. but those dreams died with the civilization that conceived them. Burned away in the fires of wars that were fought over resources that no longer exist on a planet that can no longer support life. I close the book and listen to the sounds of another faction advancing through the ruins, their augmented soldiers and child warriors and modified animals, moving with the mechanical precision of a machine designed for one purpose: to kill everything that isn't exactly like them. Soon they'll reach this shelter and I'll have to move again. Find another temporary refuge in a world where nowhere is safe and nothing is permanent except the certainty that tomorrow will be worse than today. But I'll keep moving, keep surviving, keep witnessing, because that's all that's left for the last normal human in a world gone mad. I'll be the final observer of humanity's extinction, the ultimate chronicler of a species that reached for the stars and ended up destroying itself instead. They froze me in 2025 with promises of a better world. What I found when I woke up was the end of everything. And I'm still here, still breathing toxic air and drinking contaminated water and watching the sky burn. Because someone has to remember what we lost when we chose to become monsters instead of remaining human. Someone has to witness the end. Someone has to remember that we were beautiful once before we forgot how to love anything more than we hated our enemies. The war continues. The world dies. The future we promised ourselves becomes the past we can never escape. And I remain the last dreamer in a world that has forgotten how to sleep peacefully, watching it all burn while I wait for the final darkness to claim whatever's left of the species that once dared to imagine it could live forever.